Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 72. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 22 and 23 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of the soul's passions and how the passions differ from one another. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether any passion is in the soul. This first article is intended to help us understand at the beginning what is meant by the term passio, in the Latin which can be translated passion or suffering, as well as is often translated in the Summa from the verb passive. St. Thomas will say that there is a sense in which anything that can receive something from another can be said to be passive, and therefore our soul, insofar as it is susceptible to many various influences from the external world, can be said to be passive. But when it comes to the passions of the soul, what we often term today our emotions, the key takeaway from this article for the road ahead is the following words from Aquinas, who wrote, "A thing is said to be passive from its being drawn to the agent, and when a thing recedes from what is unsuitable to it, then especially does it appear to be drawn to something else." So the kind of passiveness or suffering we mean when treating of the passions is the kind of suffering the soul undergoes when drawn by some external sensed good or driven away from some external sensed evil. These 2 directions, towards or away from, and on account of 2 different kinds of objects, whether good or evil, as perceived by us, will be used in the following question, question 23, to distinguish the various emotions we have. But for the sake of this present article, we can affirm that the passions are powers of the soul in coordination with the body, and we know that in many ways from experience, from the experience of sensible goods and evils around us causing us to suffer or undergo various passions or emotions within us. Article 2, whether passion is in the appetitive rather than the apprehensive part. Think about the difference between the intellect and the will. One, the intellect, is an apprehensive power, and the other, the will, is an appetitive power, which we covered in episodes 39 through 41 of this podcast. The difference between the two, as relevant to this article, is that the mind pulls knowledge from the external world into itself, but the will, on the other hand, reaches out and is directed towards the things it wills as they actually exist in themselves out in the world. So which of these 2 kinds of directions, which in many ways define these 2 categories of powers, the apprehensive, like the intellect, or the appetitive, like the will, do the emotions fall under? And Aquinas will argue that things like fear, desire, joy, hope, sorrow, and the rest of the passions are distinctly appetitive powers because they are caused by a kind of being drawn out towards the external, whether it be the good in question or away from the evil in question for the sake of some good. In his words, the word passion implies that the patient is drawn to that which belongs to the agent. Now the soul is drawn to a thing by the appetitive power rather than by the apprehensive power, because the soul has, through its appetitive power, an order to things as they are in themselves. Hence Aristotle says that good and evil, i.e. the objects of the appetitive power, are in things themselves. Consequently, it is evident that the nature of passion is consistent with the appetitive rather than the apprehensive part. Article 3, whether passion is in the sensitive appetite rather than in the intellectual appetite, which is called the will. Just as we have a distinction within the apprehensive powers, the powers of knowing, now that's an admittedly loose working definition, but helpful, I believe, between the power to understand, which is intellectual, as distinct from the power to see or hear or smell, which is sensual or sensitive powers, so too we have a similar division within our appetitive powers. The powers of desiring, we could say again, using a loose working definition. We have on the one hand the appetite which follows the intellect, which is the will, as well as the appetite which follows sensual apprehension. And that appetite is what we mean by the passions, which is the response to our article. The passions are a sensitive as opposed to an intellectual appetite. And we know that, first of all, because these passions go hand in hand with physical change in the body. Think about the effect coffee has on one's mood, maybe moving them from the feeling of sorrow to joy, perhaps, or looked at from the other perspective, think about how the passions of anger or fear affect then the physical body. We can also tell that the passions are of the sensual appetite because the passions are elicited precisely from the sensed good or evil. They follow upon the imagination or the external sense of a thing. As Damascene says, passion is a movement of the sensitive appetite when we imagine good or evil. In other words, passion is a movement of the irrational soul when we think of good or evil. And in response to our article, Aquinas writes, passion is properly to be found where there is corporeal transmutation, or change, we could say. This corporeal transmutation is found in the act of the sensitive appetite, for there is no need for corporeal transmutation in the act of the intellectual appetite, because this appetite is not exercised by means of a corporeal organ. It is therefore evident that passion is more properly in the act of the sensitive appetite than in that of the intellectual appetite. And we move on to question 23, how the passions differ from one another. And every time I have taught this section of the Summa, I have always made a chart to illustrate it, which is, in my opinion, the best way to understand this section, especially on the distinction and interaction among the passions. Now, Aquinas does not give us a chart, but if you would like me to give you a chart, the chart that I normally use to teach in this section, just send me an email at austin@thinkcatholic.org, and I will email a chart over to you. Then I would recommend listening to this section again, but while staring at that chart. I promise it will be much easier to understand. Article 1, whether the passions of the concupiscible part are different from those of the irascible part. So we distinguish powers by their objects, like the powers of sight and hearing are distinct by their objects of color and sound. However, sometimes it happens that two objects are not entirely distinct from one another, but only distinct according to some particular aspect. And this is what we have in the objects related to the passions. Some of our passions are directed to the sensible good considered simply, like the donut simply lying on the table, waiting for someone to eat it, but other passions are directed towards the sensible good, not considered simply, but considered specifically under the aspect of difficult to attain, like the donut lying on the table, but as guarded by an armed soldier. The emotions one is going to feel in the first scenario are not going to be the same as those they are likely to feel in the second scenario, and this because the sensible object in the different scenarios is being considered differently. In the first scenario, the donut was considered just as the donut, but in the second scenario, it is considered as fraught with danger, difficult to possess with the possibility of ensuing pain or suffering in the pursuit of it. The passions elicited by the object in the first scenario we call the concupiscible passions, and the passions elicited in the second scenario we call the irascible passions. In Aquinas' words, the object of the concupiscible power is sensible good or evil, simply apprehended as such, which causes pleasure or pain. But since the soul must of necessity experience difficulty or struggle at times in acquiring some such good or in avoiding some such evil, therefore this very good or evil, inasmuch as it is of an arduous or difficult nature, is the object of the irascible faculty. Therefore, whatever passions regard good or evil absolutely belong to the concupiscible power, for instance, joy, sorrow, love, hatred, and such like, whereas those passions which regard good or bad as arduous through being difficult to obtain or avoid, belong to the irascible faculty, such as daring, fear, hope, and the like. Article 2, whether the contrariety of the irascible passions is based on the contrariety of good and evil. And in articles like this one, along with the two to follow, a chart is especially helpful to understand what's going on. Our present question is, in brief, among the irascible passions of hope, despair, courage, fear, and anger, are they divided into opposite groups? Into one group, which are the irascible passions directed to the arduous possible good, such as the donut, although guarded by the soldier, and another group, which are the passions whose object is the evil to be overcome. That's the armed guard. And the answer is yes. Hope and despair are the passions whose object is the donut as guarded, while courage and fear are passions whose object is the armed guard, the obstacle to the good. But we can further divide these passions, as St. Thomas does, as being contrary to one another, not only by their object, but also as entailing a tending towards or tending away from that object. Therefore, those emotions, among those mentioned already, which pertain to a tending towards the object in question, we term hope and courage, which St. Thomas describes in the following words. The good which is difficult or arduous, considered as good, is of such a nature as to produce in us a tendency to it, which tendency pertains to the passion of hope. And like manner the arduous evil, considered as an evil, also contains a reason for tending to it as attempting something arduous, whereby to escape being subject to evil, and this tendency is called daring or courage. Then those emotions, among those already mentioned, which pertain to a tending away from the object in question, we term despair and fear. And concerning these, St. Thomas writes, the good which is difficult or arduous, considered as arduous or difficult, it makes us turn from it. And this pertains to the passion of despair. In like manner, the arduous evil, considered as an evil, has the aspect of something to be shunned, and this belongs to the passion of fear. And then as a kind of summary of this section, St. Thomas says, consequently, in the irascible passions we find contrariety in respect of good and evil, as between hope and fear, and also contrariety according to approach and withdrawal in respect of the same term, as between daring and fear. And again, I will refer the listener to the forthcoming chart as a helpful guide to seeing those distinctions which Aquinas is drawing out in this article. Article 3, whether any passion of the soul has no contrary. And this is anger. As St. Thomas says, anger is peculiar in this, that it cannot have a contrary, either according to approach and withdrawal, or according to the contrariety of good and evil. And that's first of all because anger is elicited by the perceived evil, perceived specifically as present or here and now before us. And when an evil is present to us, we have one of two possibilities, either to succumb to that evil, to acquiesce in it, which elicits the passion of sorrow, or to fight against it. And that is what anger is. It is the movement of attack, at least as an emotion, against the present evil. Therefore, anger cannot have the contrariety of approach versus withdrawal, for it must either endure in the midst of the present evil or succumb to that evil by turning to sorrow. Moreover, anger cannot have the contrariety of good and evil as its object, because the opposite of anger, if we imagined one, would simply be tranquility, let's say, which does not seem like a passion at all, but if we did consider it as a passion, surely it would be the passion elicited by resting in some present good, which is what joy is. Lastly, if we supposed some opposite to anger, it would have to be like anger, an irascible passion. But irascible passions have to do with the arduous good, and tranquility, not being a passion whose object would be some good difficult to attain, therefore could not even fall into the same category as anger. In St. Thomas's words, there could not be contrariety of good and evil, because the opposite of present evil is good obtained, which can no longer have the aspect of arduousness or difficulty. Nor, when once good is obtained, does there remain any other movement, except the appetite's repose in the good obtained, which repose belongs to joy, which is a passion of the concupiscible faculty. Accordingly, no movement of the soul can be contrary to the movement of anger, and nothing else than cessation from its movement is contrary thereto. Thus Aristotle says, calm is contrary to anger, but opposition not of contrariety but of negation or privation. Therefore, there is a passion in the soul which has no contrary, and this is anger. Article 4 in our last article, whether in the same power there are any passions specifically different but not contrary to one another. And as a helpful analogy in response to this article, St. Thomas asks us to consider what we would call today gravitational motion. So if we analyze the stone's motion from my hand to the ground, we can identify three distinct phases. The first phase would be when the stone is in my hand off the ground, and although it's not yet moving, it still has a very real tendency downward towards the ground, what physicists call a certain amount of potential gravitational energy when it is just in my hand. The second phase would be when the stone is actually falling and potential energy is being converted into kinetic energy, to use contemporary scientific language. The third phase would be when the stone comes to rest on the ground, when it has attained the term or end of its motion. In a similar way, among the concupiscible passions, those directed to the sensible good simply, or away from the sensible evil simply, we have an analogous threefold division. First, there is love, which is analogous to the stone off the ground, but with a very real tendency towards the ground. Second, there is desire, which is like the stone in motion. It is a movement towards the attainment of the good loved. And lastly, there is joy, which is like the stone at rest on the ground, the passion elicited by the loved good as possessed. Then when it comes to the perceived evil, which elicits passions not towards the perceived good, but away from this perceived evil, we have first hatred, which is when the evil is apprehended. Second, aversion, which is the movement away from that perceived evil. And finally, sorrow, which is the passion elicited by the hated evil as possessed. And I would refer one to the chart as well as to the text of these articles if they would like to learn more. But in summary of this article and this question, St. Thomas writes, "It is clear that in the concupiscible faculty there are three couples of passions: love and hatred, desire and aversion, joy and sadness. And in like manner there are three groups in the irascible faculty: hope and despair, fear and daring, and anger, which has no contrary passion. Consequently, there are altogether 11 passions, differing specifically 6 in the concupiscible faculty and 5 in the irascible, and under these all the passions of the soul are contained." And that does it for questions 22 and 23 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the subject of the soul's passions and how the passions differ from one another. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.